And then we go on to Joel, chapter 2. And we see in this prophecy of Joel the spiritual counterpart of the natural harvest. And we can't deal with the whole theme of Joel, but Joel really has three major sections corresponding to the three chapters. Section 1, desolation. Section 2, restoration. Section 3, judgment. And here in chapter 2 we come to the restoration. And the agent of restoration is the rain, which is a picture of the Holy Spirit. And Joel says in chapter 2 verse 23, "Be glad then, you children of Zion, and rejoice in the Lord your God, for he has given you the former rain faithfully." It fell on the early church. "And he will cause the rain to come down for you, the former rain, and the latter rain in the first month," the Passover month, March or April. And notice the purpose of the rain. "The threshing floors shall be full of wheat, and the vats shall overflow with new wine and oil." What are the three main crops? The wheat, the wine, and the oil. What brings them forth? The latter rain. What is the spiritual counterpart of the latter rain? We go on to Joel chapter 2 verse 28. "And it shall come to pass afterward." And those of you that were here yesterday, we dealt with what it was after. And you remember it was after God's people had got together and fasted and prayed and called upon him. "And it shall come to pass afterward that God says, I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh." It's interesting, Peter quoted that verse on the day of Pentecost, and he said, "This is that which is spoken by the prophet Joel." But he didn't say afterward, he said in the latter days. But in that passage in Acts 2, if you study it carefully, God says, or Peter quotes him as saying, "I will pour out of my Spirit, some of my Spirit." But here he says, "I will pour out my Spirit. I'll empty the bucket. I'll pour it all out." And he says, "On all flesh." As a good Pentecostal, when I first encountered the charismatic movement in 1960s, I was shocked. I said to myself, Anglicans, Presbyterians, Baptists, they don't have any right to the Holy Spirit. That's for us Pentecostals. But God gently reminded me that Anglicans and Baptists and Presbyterians and Plymouth Brethren all have flesh. And he said, "I'm going to pour it out on all flesh." And he proceeded to do it. He didn't consult me. He didn't ask my opinion. He just did it. But I want to point out to you, there's a lot of flesh that hasn't yet had the outpouring. Ruth was talking to you earlier about the Muslim world. Nearly 1 billion Muslims on earth. They're not quite 1 billion. And basically, there's just been a few drops. That's all. You know, statistics in the world today are interesting. Chinese are just over 1 billion people. In other words, 1 in every 5 persons on earth is Chinese. Did you know that? You can't talk about reaching the nations if you're not reaching the Chinese. And slightly smaller proportion on earth today is Muslim. What are we doing about them? Don't they have flesh? They're going to be visited, because God said it. "I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh." And then he talks about the supernatural manifestations leading up to the climax of the last days. Blood and fire and vapor of smoke in the great and terrible day of the Lord.